Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel. Now I must apologise, we haven't posted for a couple of days. Reason for that is Paul's been working on a couple of video commissions, but we're back now. A couple of weeks ago we watched the 1917 film. Really excellent film, really enjoyed it. If I've got any criticisms of it, it would be that the ground scales are a little bit compressed. But other than that, it's a fantastic film. I recommend anybody watches it if they want a good First World War film. And that got me thinking what I can do a First World War video about. So I dug out my university dissertation. It's been well known now for well over 20 years that the British Army on the Western Front went through a very steep learning curve, an operational learning curve, how to overcome trench warfare. On the other side of the wire, there was an equal defensive learning curve by the German army, and that was what my dissertation subject was basically. The British learning curve is meant to have started about 1916, the Battle of the Somme. My dissertation says that the German learning curve started straight away in 1914. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of the German defensive system in a very basic way on the Western Front. I'm not going to talk about trenches and their construction. That's a video in itself, and we'll probably do a video about that. But I wanted to look at the development of the trench systems that they fought within and the tactical way they used them. And the best way to start this is by looking at how trench warfare started. So using our trusty whiteboards, I'll give you a rundown of 1914. What I've put on the board basically is Paris, and then this is the coast, English Channel coast, basically. Now, when the Germans invaded France in August 1914, their plan was to send armies from France's eastern border over at Switzerland and up in the north and sweep down in a long line round Paris, and then of course force the Allies to submit basically. By the time they got towards Paris, the two westernmost armies were getting a bit of a gap between them, and they were splitting here. And into that gap, at the Battle of the Marne, which is where the Germans were stopped, went the French and BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. They moved into the gap, and with this massive gap between the German armies, they were getting very disorganised. They'd marched all the way from up in Belgium and down, and they were defeated at Marne, and they retired back northwards to the valley of the Aisne. There's the River Aisne, and it's in a steep valley, and there's some steep hillsides above the river. They retired back to the Aisne basically to reorganise, resupply, and await for reinforcements. So when they get to the Aisne, they dig in along the slopes. The BEF follows up, and for a couple of days there's fighting as the British cross the river, attack the heights, and try and push the Germans back. After a couple of days, this is 13th of September when the attacks first start, after a couple of days realise they can't push the Germans back. The Germans have dug in, they've got good artillery backing them up, and they're too strong to push. And the 15th of September basically said that that's when trench warfare began. That's when the Western Front started, when the two armies basically dug in opposite each other. Now, this eastern front down towards the Swiss border had already started to stalemate, but it was here on the Aisne where basically the trench warfare began. And it's ironic that trench warfare was initiated basically so that the offensive could resume. The Germans hadn't given up. They'd retreated back basically because they needed to reorganise, but they still wanted to carry on with their Schlieffen plan and get around Paris and get the Allies to surrender. So when this is stalemate along here, the Germans want to carry on their offensive, so they attack here. They're blocked by the French, so they start leapfrogging. This is what's called the so-called race to the sea. What they weren't trying to get to the sea, what they're trying to do is carry on the offensive. But every time they make a move, the French block them. Then the French will make a move, the Germans will block them. So you get a series of leapfrogging actions until they basically reach the sea at Newport up here on the Belgian border, and they can go no further. They've tried, been blocked. The French have tried to get round them, they've been blocked, and basically it's stabilising as it goes northwards till they get to the sea. Then there's no other flank to try to turn. Then you get the First Battle of Ypres that ends in November, and that brings 1914 to an end. And of course after that there's nowhere to go, the armies dig in, and the Western Front is formed by all these armies joining up their trench lines. These trench lines are, it's not in 1914 one long continuous trench line, and even down on the Aisne it starts with a series of rifle pits or a small stretch of trench, and then when they stabilise and not going anywhere, that's when they join this whole trench line up, and the Western Front is formed. They can't go anywhere, stalemated, and they just basically dig in and dig in. The German commander Falkenhayn, during the winter, he says we need to hold on to what we've got now, and they want one line and a strong one. And I'm just going to put that down. So over the winter, this trench line is stabilised, consolidated, and when we get down to March 1915, when the British, because I've looked at this learning curve of the Germans through the eyes of British offensives. The French are making offensives, of course. They have an influence on how the Germans fight, particularly in 1915, which really influences what happens in 1917. But I'm going to look at the British offensives because it's a good way of seeing this development of the German defensive system. So, March 1915, the British attack at Neuve-Chapelle. And what they're up against, this is a British line up here, they are up against a single line of trench, backed by machine gun posts about 1,000 yards behind. So Falkenhayn's plan is, you've got to hold on to this line, we can't retreat, we're not going anywhere, so everything is thrown, all the troops basically are thrown into this one line. This is the strongest part of the German defensive system, backed by these strong points, and then reserves in villages to the rear. At Neuve-Chapelle, the British broke through this pretty easy. They used a Hurricane bombardment. They didn't have a lot of artillery, so they fired it all off at once, and destroying the German trenches, advanced through, but was stopped by reserves coming up and these strong points. That's Neuve-Chapelle. That's the first British offensive on the Western Front in 1915. So it's a one line. They've got one trench line, a single trench, narrow, deep, but it's a single trench line backed by strong points. We then get to the next offensive, which is in May against Aubers Ridge. Now, German defences have developed a little bit. They've realised that that one single trench line is easy to break through. So now they have the front line, the firing trench, and then a support trench behind, about 300 yards behind. Also, it varied how far these support trenches behind, depending on the lay of the ground. So you've got a single front firing trench, fire trench, and then a support trench behind. And then you've got communication trenches now that lead across the countryside, link up the two trenches and lead across the countryside to villages behind. These communication trenches were also able to use as firing trenches. If an enemy broke through here, you can actually use these communication trenches to fire in the flank. So they were basically like fire trenches as well. But that's May 1915. The trenches have moved on a little bit. Now in May, it's fair to say that the British couldn't break through at Aubers. They managed it at Neuve-Chapelle, but they couldn't break through at Aubers. But the fear of that caused Falkenhayn to state that, and give an order in May, that he wanted a second position digging all along the Western Front. Now, when we get to September 1915 and the Battle of Loos, that second position is beginning to be developed. So you've still got your front firing trench and your support trench, and there are also redoubts built in, machine gun redoubts, sort of like strong points along this front line. Like I said, I'm not giving you a total look at where the machine guns were placed, how they were placed, but it's basically a brief look at trench system. Communications trenches leading to the back, and then this second position, this second trench position of 2 trenches, is about 2 to 3 miles behind the front line. Basically, if the British break through your front position, before they can assault your second position, they have to bring their artillery forward to bombard your second position. So it's further back, usually on loose, especially it's on a reverse slope. But even in September 15, that order from May has not been fulfilled. This second system is still under construction. But at loose, yeah, the British using gas, they managed to break through that first position. But by advancing 2 odd miles across countryside, they were blocked by the second position. So basically worked there. So that's how in 1915 the trench system is beginning to evolve because of Allied assaults. Basically they realised that the Allies can get through, we need something else to stop them because we're not going anywhere. And even with this big system here, the main bulk of the German forces were in the front system. They didn't want to yield anything, they had to hold this front system. And there was a lot of opposition from senior German commanders saying that, well, if you build a second position here, what's to keep our soldiers in the front line? They're just going to fall back to this second line. But no, it needed to be built, and everything was weighted forward to hold that front line. They didn't want to lose that front line, and even if it fell and the second line was assaulted, they wanted to regain that first line. So yeah, it was a full pack position, but that's where they wanted to be. That's where the Germans wanted to be. So everything was weighted to hold that front line. And this was just a fallback position, which, like I say, there was opposition against it. Moving on a little bit, when you get to probably one of the most famous offensives on the Western Front, the Somme, the defensive system has moved on even more. And what I put here, that's the front line system. It now consists of 3 trenches. You've got your front firing trench, support trench, and a reserve trench right at the front. Then you've got your second position, 2 or 3 miles behind, 2 trenches. And by July 1916, depending on what sources you look at, they had a third position, which was either partly finished or not, non-existent. There are some reasons to think that actually it wasn't even built at the time, and this one I'll explain in a minute. But as you can see here, there's a big thing about the Germans always having the high ground, and at the Somme it's very obvious. If you look at the lay of the land, that's just a basic generalised view of terrain, and you can see these frontline trenches are right on that forward slope, right at the top of the slope. So they've got a long field of fire, which is what the Germans wanted. Good observation, a long field of fire. Even the second line is built like that. It's on the forward slope. So this still got good observation, good field of fire. And it's still weighted to the front line. Falkenhayn still insisted they needed to hold that front line. These rear lines were basically fallback positions, but if that front line fell, counterattack troops were meant to come forward, push the British back, and they were meant to hold that front line. That's what their plan was. That's where they wanted to stay. So it's all weighted forward to hold these front line positions. As the battle went on, and I haven't shown the rest of it, because the front line fell, and then the British were up against the second line. But as that's been battered, because they're trying to run forward with building this third line, just in case that second one fell, they built a intermediate line, the Gerd line, just single line of trenches, to hold the British until they can get their third line up and running. Now it's fair to say, on the Somme, what we all think about the Somme and the German positions is their massive deep dugouts. It's built on chalk. It's on chalk uplands. So they had really deep dugouts, deep trenches. It was a really strong line. It had been, because it's been developed since 1914, this line. They've held it since 1914. So it has these massive dugouts. And I think a lot of people think that the second line was exactly the same. It wasn't. It had only been built from May 1915. It was nowhere near as strong as the front line. But of course the British broke through the front line. They broke through the second line. In September, when tanks were employed, they broke through the Gerd line and then came up against the third line. They broke through that eventually, and the Germans had to build another line here, another line here. I think they built 3 more lines beyond their third position to try and stem the Allied advance. September 1916, when we first used tanks, is a big turning point in German defensive thinking on the Western Front. There's a change of leadership for one. Falkenhayn, because of all these, basically the pressure and the fact that the British are getting through, even though the Somme is it's a meat grinder, we are making progress. Our learning curve is really kicking in during the Somme. There's a change of leadership. Falkenhayn is sacked, and I think he's sent off elsewhere. And they bring in from the Eastern Front Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Now they have different ideas on how to fight a defensive battle. They also have a gentleman in their ranks who is an expert on defensive fighting. He's experienced how the French fought in the Champagne region in 1915. And his ideas are what go to change how the Germans fought on the Western Front. His name's Lossberg, and the first source I've got I'm going to show today is called If Germany Attacks by G.C. Wynne, written in 1940, this, just as the Second World War kicked in, and it basically explains everything I'm explaining now, but in a lot more detail. He looked at the German way of fighting in the First World War, wrote his book. There's a few more. There's one by Timothy Lupfer, an American, and there's also Lossberg's own memoirs, which are in sort of like Gothic German, which I used to have. But he explains how Lossberg learned his experience fighting against the French and changed how the Germans fight. By September 1916, with this change of a high command, the whole system starts to change, and it culminates in early 1917 with a German retreat to the Hindenburg line. They hold on to the Somme and what they've got at the Somme, but they start building this brand new defence system many, many miles behind the Somme front and all the way actually along the Western Front. And that's why I've highlighted this page. Let me just say that. But the solid black line is the Western Front, as the Germans are holding it. All the dotted lines are the new defensive positions that they build behind their line. What's called, we call it the Hindenburg line. There's quite a few. There's a Hunding line, there's a Wotan line, the Siegfriedstellung is what the German name is for the Hindenburg line. But they start to build these rear defensive systems, and they are totally different to how they've been fighting on the Somme. Like I say, at the Somme, up to the Somme, and during the Somme, it's been hold that front line. You must not move. If you lose that front line, you have to take it back again. Doesn't always work, and it hasn't worked. Of course, the British have pushed them further and further back. But when you get to 1917, they build this new system miles behind, and then in February and in March, they retire back to this Hindenburg line, and it is a different way of fighting. So what I've drawn up here is a basic view of the Hindenburg line. There were two. If I talk about the Hindenburg line, which is the one that opposite the British, there were actually two of them. There was another one like this further back. This is like a very basic look at it, but this is how the Hindenburg line operated. Now you've got something totally different. If you notice at the bottom where the terrain is, this is still the front line here. Now your firing trenches, the German firing trenches, are on reverse slopes. They've realised that you don't need a long field of fire. If your enemy comes over the top here, even if you're 200 or 300 yards down that slope, you can still, with all your machine guns, stop them. You don't need to be here and give them a lot of fire before they get to you. You can still stop them here. So they're two trench lines, but it's still based on trenches, are on reverse slopes. So what you've got now is the first thing that any attacker is going to come to is your outpost line, your isolated machine gun nests, your scouts, keeping an eye on this forward slope, artillery observers as well in there. The next thing you've got is your MLR, your main line of resistance, your trenches, two lines of trenches, two strong, wide trenches with concrete bunkers in now. So when that falls, your main line of resistance is where you're going to fight your first battle. When that falls, what you've got next is what's called the battle zone. This is a large area. Well, the outpost, what I didn't say, the outpost line is like 500 to 1,000 yards wide. Then you've got your main line of resistance. Then you've got this battle zone, which is anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 yards wide. And this, if your enemy's broken through, this is where you're going to destroy your enemy when they get through. The next line is what's called the artillery protective line, because your batteries are behind this line in the rearward zone. So your enemy comes up, gets through your main line of resistance and gets into your battle zone. Battle zone's full of pillboxes, fortified locations as well. And how the system works is, on the Somme, they wanted to hold the front line. That's where the strength was. When you get to 1917, you get an elastic defence in depth. This system is designed to bend and stretch, and then it snaps back. Yes, you always want to maintain this, but if you do lose it, don't worry about it. It bends back, it flexes, and then specialist counterattack troops, counterattack divisions, when your enemy's in your battle zone, they will sweep forward, force your enemy back, and retake all your space. They still want to maintain what they've got, but now it's like we don't need to have all our troops in that front line. These, especially your outpost line, is thinly held. Your main line of resistance is really thinly held, but all your weight of your troops is here in the rear. So you let your enemy come in, you yield, and then you snap it back. And that is basically how the Hindenburg system is meant to work. Didn't always work in the early first few attacks, especially at after Vimy Ridge at Arras in 1917, in April 1917. Their counterattack divisions were too far back. They couldn't get forward quick enough. So they did lose quite a bit. But that's how this brand new way of fighting was meant to work. You didn't need a long field of fire beyond the forward slope. You can protect your troops on reverse slopes. In this 200 or 300 yards here, you can destroy an enemy attacking. And your main battle is fought in the battle zone here. You destroy your enemy and it snaps back and takes back what it is, what you've got to hold. And this is how the Germans fought from 1917 onwards. There is one sort of exception I'll mention, and that's Passchendaele. Passchendaele, the battlefield at Passchendaele at Ypres is laid out like this, but because of the high water table, digging deep trenches is not an option. It's still based around this system, trench lines, but the Germans dot a whole load of pillboxes all over the salient. And what's interesting about the British learning curve is that the British had to learn how to deal with these pillboxes and these counterattack divisions. And though we think of Passchendaele as mud and a disaster, it was actually quite a successful operation in many ways. At a few times, because of the way the British use artillery, they were able to smash these counterattack divisions that came forward with artillery before they even got anywhere near the front. But yeah, I think that's it. That is a quick overview of my dissertation, basically. There's a lot more detail in here. But I think that gives you a good look at how the German had a sort of learning curve in the First World War to basically fight a defensive battle. A lot of people reckon that the Germans were experts at trench warfare, much more than we were, but they had a steep learning curve. They knew as little as we did. They didn't expect this stalemate. They were like us, they wanted to get it over quickly. They had the equipment to dig in on the N in 1914 because and the expertise for trench warfare because they trained for it, because they were expecting to besiege towns and cities on their way in. So they practiced for trench warfare. They had the tools. We didn't have the tools at all for trench warfare. But they hadn't expected stalemate on the Western Front. But they learnt. They learnt quickly, made mistakes. Ultimately, of course, it wasn't successful. They lost the First World War. All this development was for nothing against the British operational learning curve, which overcame it all. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating subject. So I did my dissertation on it. It's a fascinating subject. This has been a really brief look at it. I think I might do a video on trenches themselves because that's a fascinating subject in itself. What our perception of a trench, although it's basically right, the Western Front was so diverse in its terrain that there is no set trench, even though there are set ways of building a trench. So I think I might do that next video. I might do on the physical aspects of a trench. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. It is a bit of a rush through, but I hope it gives you an idea of how the Western Front developed. It didn't just appear as this massive area of no man's land and massive trench systems. It grew from 1914 in fits and starts, some success and some ultimately defeat. But it's a fascinating subject to look at how the Germans developed their defence system. So I'll leave it at that, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you very soon. Bye.